October 30th, 1944. Somewhere over Hanover, Germany. Colonel Hubert Zemke felt the first violent shudder tear through his P-51 Mustang. Then another. The thunderstorm he'd ordered his formation to avoid had caught him alone, and now atmospheric forces far beyond any enemy fighter were ripping his aircraft apart. The wings separated from the fuselage with a sickening metallic scream. Zemke, commander of the legendary 56th Fighter Group, the man General Jimmy Doolittle had called his greatest fighter group commander, was tumbling through German skies with 17.5 aerial victories to his name, and nothing but a parachute between him and the earth below. For 5 days he evaded capture, 5 days of hiding in forests, moving at night, trying to work his way toward Allied lines. But eventually, weak from hunger and exhaustion, he was apprehended and transported to a place every American pilot had been warned about: the Luftwaffe Interrogation Center at Oberursel, just north of Frankfurt. What happened next would haunt Zemke for the rest of his life. Not because of brutality, not because of torture, but because of coffee. A friendly German in civilian clothes greeted him warmly, knew his name, knew his unit, knew details about the 56th Fighter Group that should have been classified. The man offered him a comfortable chair, real coffee, cigarettes. He took Zemke on walks through the surrounding forest, discussing aviation, sharing stories, treating him not as a prisoner, but as a fellow professional. They talked about flying, about home, about inconsequential things. Days later, when Zemke was finally transferred to a permanent prisoner camp, he sat in his bunk trying to piece together what had happened. He had given nothing away. He was certain of it. He had followed his training to the letter. Name, rank, and serial number. Nothing more. But something gnawed at him, a creeping, uncomfortable realization. There is no doubt in my mind that he did extract something, Zemke would later admit, but I haven't the slightest idea what. The man who had so thoroughly disarmed one of America's most celebrated fighter commanders was a German enlisted man, a former textile salesman who had never received a single day of formal interrogation training. His name was Hanns Scharff, and his weapon was not fear, it was friendship. By the end of the war, Scharff had interrogated over 500 American and British fighter pilots. He never raised his voice. He never struck a prisoner. He never made a single threat. And yet his success rate was so extraordinary that only about 20 of those 500 pilots managed to reveal nothing at all. The rest, trained specifically to resist interrogation, cracked, many of them without even realizing they had given anything away. What Scharff understood, and what the U.S. military would eventually pay him to teach them, was a truth that challenged everything the Allies thought they knew about extracting information from unwilling sources. Sometimes the most devastating weapon in an interrogator's arsenal isn't pain. It's a cup of coffee and a pleasant conversation. To understand why Scharff's methods were so revolutionary, you first have to understand what every Allied pilot was trained to expect if captured over enemy territory. The nightmare began before they ever left the ground. Training films like 1944's Resisting Enemy Interrogation painted a vivid picture of what awaited downed airmen. German interrogators depicted as cold, calculating, willing to use any means necessary to extract information. The Gestapo loomed large in every briefing, their reputation for sadistic torture well established and deliberately reinforced. Pilots were told stories of beatings, of isolation, of mock executions. They watched dramatizations of prisoners broken by relentless psychological pressure. The message was clear. If you are captured, expect the worst. Trust no one. Give nothing but name, rank, and serial number. Any additional information, no matter how seemingly harmless, could cost American lives. This training created a specific psychological framework in the minds of American airmen. They prepared themselves for adversarial interrogation, for threats and violence. They steeled themselves against fear. They practiced responses, rehearsed resistance. They knew the enemy would try to break them, and they built mental fortifications accordingly. What they did not prepare for was kindness. The Geneva Convention of 1929, which governed the treatment of prisoners of war, required only that captured personnel provide their name, rank, and serial number. Any interrogation beyond those basic identifiers was technically prohibited. From using coercion, but the reputation of Nazi Germany, the stories filtering back from the Eastern Front and from resistance fighters across occupied Europe, convinced most Allied personnel that such rules would be meaningless once they fell into German hands. The Gestapo, Hitler's secret police, had earned their terrifying reputation through years of documented atrocities. Political prisoners, resistance fighters, Jews, and countless others had been subjected to systematic torture in their custody. For an American pilot parachuting into German-controlled territory, the fear of falling into Gestapo hands was often greater than the fear of being shot down in the first place. This fear was not irrational. The SS and Gestapo did interrogate some captured personnel, particularly those suspected of being spies or intelligence operatives. Their methods were precisely as brutal as Allied training suggested. But what most pilots didn't know was that the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, operated under a completely different philosophy. The Luftwaffe was, in many ways, the most aristocratic and professional branch of the German military. Many of its senior officers came from old Prussian military families with traditions of honor that predated the Nazi regime.
They viewed themselves as warriors, engaged in an honorable contest with fellow aviators, the Knights of the Air. This self-image translated into a treatment of captured enemy pilots that, while far from luxurious, generally adhered to the Geneva Convention's requirements. More importantly, the Luftwaffe's intelligence apparatus had learned something through trial and error that would take Allied intelligence decades to fully accept. Torture simply doesn't work very well. In the early years of the war, some German interrogators had used rough methods, threats, isolation, occasional physical abuse. The results were disappointing. Prisoners either said nothing or said whatever they thought their captors wanted to hear. The information was unreliable, often contradictory,
and rarely of operational value. Physical coercion produced noise, not intelligence. By 1943, when Hans Scharff entered the interrogation business, the Luftwaffe had developed a sophisticated system based entirely on psychological manipulation rather than physical abuse. They didn't need to beat information out of prisoners because they had discovered something far more effective. They would make prisoners want to talk. The man who would become Nazi Germany's most effective interrogator was never supposed to be in the German military at all. Hans Joachim Gottlob Scharff was born on December 16, 1907, in Rostenburg, East Prussia, what is now Kętrzyn, Poland. His father was a Prussian military officer who earned 2 Iron Crosses for bravery in World War I before being killed in action on the Western Front. His mother came from one of Germany's wealthiest textile families, and young Hans grew up in their villa in Leipzig, surrounded by art and culture. Unlike his father, Scharff had no interest in military life. He trained in the family's textile business, developing skills in salesmanship and human relations that would later prove unexpectedly valuable. In the early 1930s, he was sent to South Africa to manage the overseas operations of Adlerwerke, a German automotive company. He excelled in the position, earning promotion after promotion. More significantly, he married Margaret Stokes, the daughter of a British war hero, a Royal Flying Corps squadron leader from Rhodesia. By 1939, Scharff was a successful international businessman with a British wife, 2 children, and no particular loyalty to the Nazi regime. He was, by all accounts, precisely the sort of cosmopolitan German the Nazis distrusted. That summer, the family returned to Germany for a vacation. They never left. When war broke out in September 1939, Scharff found himself trapped. As a German citizen of military age, he was conscripted into the Wehrmacht and assigned to an infantry unit destined for the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front, where German casualties were astronomical. The Eastern Front, where his chances of surviving the war were slim. Margaret Scharff understood that her husband needed to find a safer assignment, or he would almost certainly die. Through family connections, she arranged for a Wehrmacht colonel, an old friend of the family, to learn about Hans's fluency in English. In an army desperate for translators, this skill was far too valuable to waste on infantry duty. Scharff was pulled from his unit and assigned to a translator company. For the next few years, Scharff worked as an administrative clerk, a position he found mind-numbingly boring. At one point, assigned to punch holes in documents for filing, he calculated the cost per hole and joked about it to his adjutant. The comment made its way to a general, who summoned Scharff for what he expected to be a reprimand. Instead, impressed by the young man's intellect and personality, the general arranged for his transfer to the Luftwaffe Interrogation Center at Oberursel. Scharff arrived at Auswertestelle West, Intelligence and Evaluation Center West, in 1943, expecting to work in administration. The facility, located in a pleasant farmhouse complex about 12 kilometers northwest of Frankfurt, was the central processing point for all captured Allied aircrew from the Western Theater. Every British, American, Canadian, and Australian pilot shot down over Western Europe passed through this facility. The interrogation section was staffed by a small cadre of officers who had earned their positions through language proficiency rather than any particular training in intelligence work. They were university professors, journalists, former businessmen, globetrotters, men of education and cultural sophistication who happened to speak excellent English. None had formal interrogation training. All learned on the job. Scharff was assigned as an assistant to two experienced interrogators named Wayland and Schroeder, who handled American fighter pilots. His role was to observe and learn. And observe he did, paying close attention to what worked and what didn't, noting the techniques that produced results and those that led nowhere. Then, in late 1943, fate intervened in the most dramatic possible way. Wayland and Schroeder accepted an invitation to fly in a Fieseler Storch light aircraft with a Luftwaffe fighter pilot from the nearby Eschborn Air Base. The engine malfunctioned. The plane crashed. The pilot and Schroeder were killed instantly. Wayland died of his injuries days later. Without warning, without preparation, without any formal training whatsoever, Hans Scharff found himself promoted to lead interrogation officer for American fighter pilots of the 8th and 9th Air Forces. He had watched prisoners being mistreated by other interrogators. He had seen the fear in their eyes, the way they shut down, retreated into themselves, gave nothing useful. He had witnessed the failure of coercion firsthand. He vowed to do things differently. The Luftwaffe Intelligence and Evaluation Center at Oberursel processed approximately 42,000 Allied prisoners of war during the course of the conflict. Of these, around 25,000 underwent formal interrogation. The facility could handle about 200 prisoners at any given time, though during peak periods following major air battles, as many as 5 prisoners might be crammed into cells designed for one. The process began the moment a captured airman arrived. He was stripped, searched, and issued either German coveralls or allowed to keep the clothes in which he'd been shot down, minus leather flight jackets, which were routinely confiscated. Then came solitary confinement. The isolation cells were deliberately designed to break down psychological resistance. Prisoners were denied cigarettes, toilet articles, and Red Cross food packages. They had no reading material, no writing implements, nothing to occupy their minds. Many cells were equipped with hidden listening devices. Some had heating systems that could be cranked up to uncomfortable temperatures. The message was clear. You are alone. You are powerless. We control everything about your existence. After days of this treatment, prisoners were brought before a reception officer who presented them with a document that appeared to be a standard Red Cross form. It asked innocent-seeming questions about next of kin and home address, information the Red Cross would need to notify families that their loved ones were alive and in custody. But scattered among these innocuous questions were others of a distinctly military nature. Unit designation, base location, commanding officer, aircraft type. Prisoners who refused to complete the form were warned that their families might not be notified of their survival. Those who pointed out that only name, rank, and serial number were required under the Geneva Convention were told that failure to provide additional identifying information would force the Luftwaffe to assume they were spies, and spies were turned over to the Gestapo. This was the environment into which Hans Scharff stepped as lead interrogator. The infrastructure of psychological pressure already existed. The preliminary softening up had already been accomplished. His job was to take prisoners who had been isolated, stressed, and frightened, and extract operational intelligence without violating the Geneva Convention's prohibition on coercion. His approach was revolutionary in its simplicity. He would be genuinely friendly. Not friendly as a manipulation tactic, though it certainly was that, but authentically warm, curious, interested. Scharff treated his prisoners as fellow professionals, as aviators worthy of respect. He learned everything he could about each man before meeting him: his hometown, his family, his hobbies, his squadron, his aircraft. When a prisoner entered his office, Scharff already knew enough about him to carry on a detailed conversation. "Welcome to Oberursel," he would say warmly. "Please, sit down. Would you like some coffee? A cigarette?" The contrast with days of isolation and deprivation was deliberate and Scharff powerful. Then Scharff would begin to talk, not interrogate, talk. He would share information, demonstrating that he already knew virtually everything about the prisoner's unit, its operations, its personnel. He would produce files thick with photographs and newspaper clippings. He would mention specific missions, name specific pilots, describe specific aircraft modifications. The message was unmistakable. We already know everything. You cannot tell us anything we don't already know. This was the foundational technique that modern researchers would later call the illusion of knowing it all. By presenting himself as already fully informed, Scharff accomplished several psychological objectives simultaneously. He reduced the prisoner's motivation to resist, since resistance seemed pointless against such comprehensive knowledge. He made any information the prisoner did provide seem like mere confirmation of known facts rather than betrayal of secrets. And, most importantly, he created a framework in which the prisoner could talk freely, believing himself to be saying nothing new, while actually filling in crucial gaps in German intelligence. The second crucial technique was never asking direct questions. Instead, Scharff would make statements, some accurate, some deliberately inaccurate, and wait for the prisoner to respond. Human beings have a powerful, almost irresistible urge to correct errors. It's a fundamental aspect of how we communicate, a way of establishing shared understanding and demonstrating competence. The tracer bullet incident became perhaps the most famous example of this technique in action. Scharff noticed that American fighter planes sometimes fired tracer rounds that left white smoke trails instead of the usual red. In conversation with a prisoner, he casually mentioned that this must be due to a chemical shortage affecting American ammunition production. The pilot immediately corrected him. No, there was no chemical shortage. The white tracers were intentionally different. They indicated to the pilot that he was running low on ammunition. In that single moment of polite correction, the prisoner had revealed operationally critical intelligence. German fighter commanders now knew that when American planes began firing white tracers, they were nearly out of ammunition. They were vulnerable. The prisoner had no idea he had given anything away. He'd merely corrected a factual error in casual conversation. Scharff's techniques were devastatingly effective against precisely the men who should have been most resistant to interrogation, America's finest combat pilots. Colonel Hubert Zemke was one of the most celebrated fighter commanders of the war. Under his leadership, the 56th Fighter Group had become the scourge of the Luftwaffe, accumulating more aerial victories than any other American outfit in the European theater. Zemke himself had 17.5 kills. He was a stern, disciplined professional, exactly the kind of
officer who should have been immune to psychological manipulation. After his capture in October 1944,
Zemke was brought to Oberursel, expecting the worst. What he encountered was Scharff's friendly smile, his comfortable office, his cups of genuine coffee. They discussed aviation. They took walks through the forest surrounding the camp. Scharff treated Zemke with the respect due a fellow warrior, never pressuring him for information, never making threats. Zemke gave nothing away. He was certain of it. He maintained discipline throughout, and yet, decades later, he would still wonder what he had inadvertently revealed. The experience haunted him precisely because he couldn't identify any specific failure, any moment of weakness. Scharff had gotten something. Zemke was sure of it, but he never knew what. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski presented an even greater challenge. The top American ace in the European theater, with 28 confirmed aerial victories, Gabreski had been shot down on July 20th, 1944, when his propeller clipped the ground during a strafing run. He evaded capture for 5 days before being apprehended and sent to Oberursel. Gabreski was one of the few prisoners who managed to give Scharff almost nothing. The Polish-American pilot's stubbornness and suspicion proved impervious even to Scharff's charm. But remarkably, this failure didn't breed resentment. Instead, the two men developed a genuine respect for one another. After the war, Gabreski and Scharff remained friends for nearly 50 years, corresponding regularly until Scharff's death in 1992. Perhaps the most extraordinary episode involved Lieutenant Colonel Einar Malmström, commanding officer of the 356th Fighter Group, shot down over France in April 1944. Scharff developed such rapport with Malmström that he arranged for the American prisoner to visit a nearby Luftwaffe fighter base, where German pilots showed him their Messerschmitt Bf-109s and discussed aerial tactics. According to accounts published in Raymond Tolliver's book, The Interrogator, Malmström was even allowed to take brief control of a Fiesler Storch light aircraft during a flight over the area. A German prisoner of war flying a German aircraft over German-occupied territory in the middle of the war. The story strains credulity, but multiple sources confirm at least the visit to the fighter base and extended fraternization with German pilots. None of Malmström's fellow prisoners attempted escape during these extraordinary outings. They had given their word of honor not to flee, and Scharff trusted that word implicitly. That trust, so alien to the adversarial framework of military captivity, was itself a weapon. It made prisoners feel obligated, made them want to reciprocate the good treatment they received, made them lower their guard in ways they never would have against a threatening interrogator. The results spoke for themselves. By the war's end, Scharff had interrogated over 500 American and British fighter pilots. His success rate was estimated at above 95%. One of his superiors at Oberursel, Sergeant Nagel, stated simply, "I read the reports each interrogator wrote, and in this way knew which ones were best." Scharff was unbeatable. Another captured pilot offered perhaps the most telling assessment of Scharff's abilities. Hans Scharff could probably get a confession of infidelity from a nun. The war ended in May 1945. Germany lay in ruins, its military shattered, its leadership dead or facing trial at Nuremberg. For most former German soldiers, the post-war years meant denazification proceedings, civilian reconstruction work, or lengthy imprisonment. For Hans Scharff, the end of the war marked the beginning of an entirely unexpected second career. American intelligence officers studying German interrogation methods after the war were stunned by what they found at Oberursel. The Luftwaffe's systematic, non-coercive approach had produced intelligence of extraordinary quality, and at the center of their most successful operations was this former textile salesman who had never received a day of formal training. In 1948, the United States Air Force made Scharff an offer that would have seemed impossible just 3 years earlier. They invited him to America to lecture on his interrogation techniques. Think about that for a moment. The U.S. military, still processing the horrors of the Holocaust and the war crimes of Nazi Germany, invited a former Luftwaffe interrogator to come to Washington and teach American intelligence officers how to extract information from prisoners. It was an acknowledgement, however implicit, that the enemy had developed something worth learning. Scharff traveled to the United States, where he lectured at the Pentagon and various military installations. He explained his philosophy, demonstrated his techniques, shared the insights he had developed through years of practical experience. American intelligence officers listened, took notes, and began incorporating his methods into their own training programs. The U.S. military later incorporated Scharff's methods into its curriculum at interrogation schools. Many of his techniques are still taught today, a legacy that extends more than 70 years beyond the war that produced them. But Scharff's American adventure didn't end with a few lectures. He was granted immigration status and decided to make the United States his permanent home. Rather than continue in intelligence work, he returned to his first love, art. During his youth in Leipzig, Scharff had received training in artistic techniques. In the 1950s, he began creating mosaic artwork, initially selling decorated furniture and small pieces in the New York area. His work proved immediately popular. He expanded his business, eventually relocating to Los Angeles, where Hans Scharff Designs became a significant force in the mosaic art world. His most famous works are on public display across the United States. The California State Capitol building features Scharff mosaics. Los Angeles City Hall contains his work. The Epcot Center at Walt Disney World displays his art. But perhaps most remarkably, the 15-foot arched mosaic walls depicting the story of Cinderella inside Cinderella Castle at Walt Disney World in Florida were created by the man who had once extracted secrets from American fighter pilots through coffee and conversation. Nazi Germany's master interrogator spent his final decades creating fairy tales in glass and stone. Scharff died on September 10, 1992, in California at the age of 84. His obituaries noted his artistic achievements and his wartime service, but they couldn't quite capture the strange trajectory of his life, from Prussian aristocracy to South African business to German military service to American immigration to Disney World. Throughout it all, he never wavered from his core belief that kindness was more effective than cruelty, that understanding produced better results than fear, that the way you treat people matters, even when those people are your enemies. The techniques Hans Scharff pioneered have proven remarkably durable. More than 70 years after the end of World War II, researchers continue to study and validate his approach. In 2009, the FBI established the High Value Interrogation Group, a multi-agency task force designed to develop effective, legal interrogation techniques for suspected terrorists. One of the methods they investigated was what researchers had begun calling the Scharff technique. Scientists at the University of Gothenburg in Sweden, led by psychology professor Per Anders Granhag, conducted extensive laboratory experiments comparing Scharff's approach to traditional direct questioning. Their findings, published in multiple peer-reviewed journals, confirmed what Scharff had discovered through practice. His techniques consistently produced more new information while simultaneously causing subjects to underestimate how much they had revealed. The mechanism is elegant in its simplicity. When someone asks you direct questions, you know exactly what they're trying to learn. You can consciously decide what to reveal and what to withhold. You're acutely aware of the information exchange taking place. But when someone presents statements for confirmation or denial, when they engage you in seemingly casual conversation, when they appear to already know everything anyway, the calculus changes entirely. Subjects in the experimental studies who faced Scharff-style interrogation not only revealed more information, but believed they had revealed less. The technique masked its own effectiveness, leaving subjects convinced they had maintained their secrets while actually giving away crucial details. This research took on particular urgency in the years following September 11, 2001, when the United States government authorized what it euphemistically called enhanced interrogation techniques, methods that included waterboarding, sleep deprivation, stress positions, and other forms of physical and psychological abuse. The morality of these techniques sparked fierce debate. What received less attention was whether they actually worked. Critics of enhanced interrogation, including experienced interrogators like FBI agent Ali Soufan, pointed to Scharff's legacy as evidence that rapport-building approaches produced superior intelligence. Soufan, who successfully interrogated high-value terrorism suspects using non-coercive methods, explicitly cited Scharff as a model for effective, ethical interrogation. The contrast couldn't have been starker. On one hand, techniques borrowed from programs designed to help American personnel resist enemy torture, methods that produced unreliable information, damaged America's international reputation, and almost certainly inspired additional terrorism recruitment. On the other hand, a 70-year-old approach developed by a German enlisted man who took prisoners on walks through the forest and offered them coffee. The science consistently supports Scharff's intuitions. Torture and coercion produce compliance, not accuracy. People will say whatever they think their torturers want to hear in order to make the pain stop. The information generated is unreliable, contradictory, and often completely false. Building rapport, by contrast, creates conditions in which subjects actually want to communicate, in which they lower their guard, in which they reveal information without even realizing they're doing so. Scharff understood this instinctively. The modern research has simply quantified what he learned through practice. Kindness works. There is something almost uncomfortable about celebrating the achievements of a man who served in Nazi Germany's military, who helped that regime prosecute its war, whose intelligence work contributed to the deaths of American and British airmen. The moral complexity of Scharff's story resists easy categorization. He was not a Nazi. He joined the party neither by choice nor by conviction. He was conscripted, trapped by circumstance, doing what he had to do to survive. His methods, however effective, were distinguished by their humanity in an era defined by inhumanity. He never tortured anyone. He never ordered anyone tortured. In a war that produced Auschwitz and the Bataan Death March and the rape of Nanking, he extracted information through coffee and conversation. And yet, his intelligence helped German fighters intercept American bombers. His reports helped the Luftwaffe improve its defensive tactics. American airmen died, at least in part, because of information Hans Scharff extracted from their comrades. The fact that he did so politely doesn't change that fundamental reality. Perhaps the most honest assessment is that Scharff was a decent man operating within an indecent system, doing his job with skill and professionalism,
while avoiding the worst excesses of the regime he served. He was no hero. He was no villain. He was something more complicated, a human being caught up in historical forces beyond his control, making choices that were morally ambiguous then and remain morally ambiguous now. What is not ambiguous is the legacy of his techniques. The Scharff method has been adopted by law enforcement and intelligence agencies around the world precisely because it works better than the alternatives. It produces more reliable information. It maintains the dignity of both interrogator and subject. It doesn't create false confessions or inaccurate intelligence. It doesn't generate the kind of backlash that coercive methods inevitably produce. In an era when debates about interrogation ethics continue to rage, when governments still authorize brutal methods in the name of security, Scharff's example offers a different path. You don't have to be cruel to be effective. You don't have to dehumanize your enemies to defeat them. Sometimes the most devastating weapon in your arsenal is simply treating people like human beings.
The American pilots who sat in Scharff's office, drinking his coffee, walking through his forest, never forgot the experience. Many remained puzzled for the rest of their lives about what exactly they had given away. Some became his friends. All remembered his kindness. And that kindness, in the end, was what made him so dangerous. The story of Hans Scharff challenges comfortable assumptions about warfare, about interrogation, about the relationship between means and ends. He demonstrated that you could be extraordinarily effective without being extraordinarily cruel. He proved that understanding your opponent, genuinely engaging with them as a human being, produced better results than treating them as an object to be broken. His legacy lives on in interrogation rooms around the world, in academic research programs, in training curricula for intelligence officers and law enforcement personnel. The Scharff technique has become a standard reference point in discussions of ethical, effective interrogation. But perhaps his most important legacy is simpler than all of that. In the midst of history's most devastating war, surrounded by industrialized murder and systematic brutality, one man chose a different path. He proved that kindness could be a weapon, and a more effective one than fear. The next time you hear someone argue that extreme circumstances justify extreme methods, remember Hans Scharff. Remember the prisoners who walked away from his office convinced they had given nothing away, unaware of the crucial intelligence they had just provided. Remember the American military that invited a former enemy to teach them his secrets. Remember that the most successful interrogator of Nazi Germany never raised his voice, never struck a prisoner, never made a single threat. He just offered them coffee and waited for them to talk. If this story of psychological warfare and the power of unexpected kindness fascinated you, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell so you don't miss our next deep dive into the hidden corners of World War II history. Drop a comment below telling us what topic you'd like us to explore next. And if you want to support the channel, consider liking this video and sharing it with someone who loves military history as much as you do. Until next time, remember, in warfare, as in life, the most powerful weapons aren't always the ones that cause the most pain.